There's still a few people drifting in, so I'm just giving everybody a chance to show up. But can you hear me? I have to. Is it working? Okay. Can you hear me if I stand this far? No? I can't get closer without leaning into it. All right, I'll try to do this. All right, so welcome. For those who I don't know and don't know me, my name is John Hollicka, and I'm a professor of visual arts here at USD. And I want to begin our gathering tonight by acknowledging that we are present as uninvited guests on the unceded lands of the Kumeyaay people. And I acknowledge that those of us who are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants are fundamentally settlers on the lands of others. And as settlers, we're the beneficiaries of a long history of theft, repression, enslavement, and cultural erasure. As an immigrant myself, as an immigrant to America, I struggle with the reality that I'm also a settler on the stolen land of indigenous populations, and I seek to find ways of achieving justice for the people whose lands we occupy. I'd also like to start this evening, as this is the first night of Hanukkah, I would like to begin by wishing all of our Jewish friends and their families a peaceful and blessed Hanukkah. And thanks for those who are here on this first night of Hanukkah, who might want to be home celebrating with their family. I'm part of a faculty-student coalition that organized this teach-in in response to the horrific violence that continues to extinguish the lives of thousands of civilians in Palestine and Israel. And on behalf of the organizing coalition, I'd like to welcome you to this teach-in. This evening's panel is the third event and the final event in the fall 2023 Gaza at USD Teach-In. There are more events coming. Well, there are more events in the works, let's say, for the spring 2024 semester, and I hope that you'll keep an eye on those events as they become advertised and attend them. Some of you I recognize, and I hope more of you were here for the first lecture by Dr. Farid Abdel-Noor on November 29th. Farid gave a brilliant lecture titled Devaluing Palestinian Lives, and masterfully presented a comprehensive overview of the 100-year history of marginalization of the Palestinians' interests and desires, the forced displacement of the majority of their population, the ever-expanding occupation and expropriation of their lands, the repression of their remaining population, and the ongoing erasure of Palestinian history and culture. We recorded that talk, but the camera had overheated at 36 minutes, so we only have the beginning of that talk. So his talk fried that camera. I hope that you also benefit, for those of you that were here, from the panel discussion that was presented on December 1st. A small group of scholars really brilliantly analyzed histories of proposed and imposed solutions in Palestine, Israel. The panel was titled One State, Two States, No State. And my colleague in international relations, Dr. Randy Willoughby, described the four presentations for that panel as a grand slam, and indeed they were. I'm very grateful for the eloquence and insights of each of the speakers, and I'm equally grateful for your desire to learn more about the violence that is washing over Gaza. The goal of this teaching is to examine the roots of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis by analyzing many of the policies, ideologies, and conditions that have led to it. Our aim is also to reflect on the aftermath of the Nakba, the term that the Palestinians used to describe the great catastrophe that started in 1948 with the mass displacement of the majority of the Palestinian population from their homes and homeland. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians continues to this very day, as the horrific cruelty and violence against the civilian population of Gaza so clearly illustrate. A lot of people want us to believe that the struggle between Palestinian and Israeli is an ancient struggle, or that it's a conflict between Muslims and Jews. But those people are either misinformed or they're trying to deceive us, in order to distract us from the fact that the conflict is fundamentally between a powerful settler colonial enterprise that, with the help of Western Empire, claims the land of Palestinians. And the conflict is between settler colonialism and an indigenous population resisting occupation, erasure, and oppression. The indigenous population, like all indigenous populations that have been oppressed, they want to begin to figure out ways to heal the generational wounds that continue to be inflicted on the people of Palestine, on their culture as well. This evening's group of scholars will examine competing and overlapping visions of Zionism and the impact of those worldviews on the development and evolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Their talk will dissect the prevailing understanding that Zionism is a unified and monolithic ideology of a Jewish state that must be defended by, and I quote, an iron wall of Jewish bayonets, to use the words of Zev Jabotinsky, the intellectual father and militant, the intellectual father of militarist Zionism, whose ethno-nationalist, settler colonial visions have directly led to the century full of hatred, cruelty, and violence. I'm gratified by the fact that the objectives of this teach-in are directly informed by USD's mission of an institution of higher learning that promotes critical thinking and open-minded pursuit of knowledge. The teach-in is also very closely aligned with USD's mission as a Catholic institution that honors the dignity of all humans, champions the rights of the oppressed, and supports justice as the path to peace, reconciliation, and coexistence. There will be people in this room and in this community that will find some of the information troubling. I urge you to practice self-care and to seek resources on campus for support. I also urge you to seek opportunities to continue learning broadly and deeply about the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, and to seek dialogue with caring people that want to investigate creative, just, and sustainable solution to this conflict. Before I introduce this evening's speakers, I'd like to take a moment to thank each and every member of the Gaza at USD Faculty Student Coalition, and there's a number of them here, for their committed effort towards informing our community. We're a pretty diverse group of people, but we all share a common faith that is centered in the belief that knowledge provides the most direct path towards justice, and that justice offers the only road towards sustainable peace. I'm honored to introduce the speakers of on tonight's panel. I'm going to introduce all three, and then they'll take over. Dr. Jonathan Graubart is professor of political science at San Diego State University. He specializes in the areas of international relations, international law, Zionism, Jewish descent, and Israel-Palestine. Dr. Graubart received his PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2002, and his JD from UC Berkeley Law School in 1989. Not 18, you're not that old, Jonathan. His recent book was published by Temple University Press in 2003. It's titled Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs. And I'm happy to say that Jonathan has agreed to come to USD in the spring as an extension of this teach-in to do a full lecture about his book, and we very much look forward to that. Dr. Ted Falk is an adjunct professor of Middle East, Islamic, and Jewish history at USD, and we all think that those course offerings should be increased, and the topic should be broadened and expanded within the history department. Ted received his PhD from UCSD, research in non-Muslim identity in the Ottoman Levant. And Ted wants to inform our students that there are spots remaining for his class on film and historical memory in the Middle East. So register now for History 394 for the spring semester. And last but not least is Dr. Rico Monge. He's Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. His doctorate is in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and his research and teaching specialize in comparative Christianity and Islam, both theory and religion, and continental philosophy, including political philosophy. Rico was born into a nominally Roman Catholic family and raised in evangelical Christian Zionism. But his graduate studies in theology led him to reject Christian Zionism and to be received into the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's currently an ordained deacon in the Eastern Orthodox Church, who, in his capacity, has worked extensively in Palestinian American Christian communities and has participated in numerous Jewish-Christian dialogues. I'm really grateful for their presence, and I'm grateful for your presence. So if you can help me welcome them, I would appreciate it. Jonathan, you're on. Do we need to do anything up here? Or
no. And this is the microphone?
Yeah, it's awesome.
Okay, good. Everyone can hear me? Yeah. All right, so I've been teaching at San Diego State since 2002, but this is the first time I've spoken at University of San Diego. I've gone to many events here over the years, but it's an honor to finally be speaking here. All right, so I have two big takeaways then. One is that historically there was no single Zionism. That's why it's even hard for me still, like, if one's asked, okay, well, are you Zionist or are you anti-Zionist? A lot of it does depend on what one means by Zionism. My second big takeaway, which is really the heart of today's talk, is Zionism did not always mean support for a hegemonic Jewish nation state. Many of the early Zionist Jews who settled in historic Palestine did not have a Jewish state as their end goal. Up through 1948, there was a sizable Zionist Jewish dissent movement that strongly opposed the establishment of a Jewish nation state. And even the mainstream Zionist leaders and organizations did not openly support a Jewish nation state in Palestine until the late 1930s. So I'll start with just a brief breakdown of distinct Zionist positions, looking first at the period between the emergence of modern Zionism, which is the late 19th century, up through 1917 as World War I is coming to an end. So in this early period, you could say the main divide between Zionists were political Zionists like Theodor Herzl, kind of the modern founder of Zionism, and practical Zionists. Political Zionists like Theodor Herzl did not live in historic Palestine, but courted support from the dominant powers to set up a Jewish political entity in Palestine. So they were elitist and very explicitly imperialist friendly. The practical Zionists were just looking to create a life and a new kind of Jewish community in historic Palestine. Their ideologies varied. Many were socialist and anti-imperialist. Some did hope that their efforts would eventually lead to a Jewish state, but importantly, up to this period, the Ottoman Empire that controlled Palestine firmly opposed any kind of Jewish state. So Theodor Herzl died essentially a failure in terms of what he was hoping. Then we skip to the Balfour Declaration of 1917 as World War I's coming to an end, and it looks like the Brits are going to take over Palestine. This is a major victory for the political Zionists led by Chaim Weizmann. The Balfour Declaration commits Great Britain to support a, quote, Jewish homeland, unquote, in Palestine, which entailed formal political, economic, and social institutions for the Jewish community. Importantly, this included the right to purchase land and the encouragement of Jewish immigration, mostly from Europe. The Brits, by contrast, offered nothing remotely comparable to Palestine's Arabs, despite that they made up more than 90% of the population at the time. So not surprisingly, the Arabs in Palestine and in the neighboring region became quite alarmed. To be sure, the Brits refrained from supporting an actual Jewish state, and made it clear that the new Jewish community should not talk of a Jewish state. Still, from the perspective of political Zionists who wanted ultimately a state, this was a big leg up, because now they could create the facts on the ground and create a state in the making. So the Jewish community in Palestine then takes shape, known as the Yishuv, and it gains strength over the next 3 decades, so from the 1920s to the post-World War II era. And I would roughly divide the movements as following, the Zionist movements. The most influential and numerous were the socialist Zionists, or the labor Zionists. They sought ultimately both a Jewish state and a socialist one. And they attracted many idealistic followers from Central and Eastern Europe, including, say, my grandparents' and great-grandparents' generation. And they did develop exciting institutions like the socialist agricultural collectives known as the kibbutzim, labor unions, the principle of health care, the minimization of profit. In fact, it was this heavy socialist element of the early Zionists that attracted a lot of people on the European left, the American left. I don't know if anyone knows the old folk band, the Weavers, made up of Pete Seeger, but they had a hit song in the 1950s, which was an adaptation of a Zionist song called Say Not, Say Not, Say No. So at one point, Zionism was really popular among the socialist left. Besides the socialist Zionists, perhaps their political allies were general Zionists. They had a variety of non-socialist ideologies, mostly capitalist. Their primary aim was to create a Jewish state. So while there were various divides between the socialist Zionists and the general Zionists, they shared the same overall national and foreign policy stance. Both were careful to refrain from openly supporting a Jewish state, at least until the late 1930s, but sought to create facts on the ground for a state in the making. Both worked on land purchase and immigration, and they hoped to put off a confrontation with Palestine's Arabs until they were strong enough that they knew they could win. They also had the shared foreign policy of courting Great Britain and other leading powers to support robust Zionist growth in Palestine. I'll now turn briefly to the dissenters within the Zionist world on the right and on the left. So John already referred to the ones on the right. They were the militant revisionists led by Zev Jabotinsky, later Menachem Begin. The current Prime Minister Netanyahu is part of that tradition. They were outspoken in actually demanding a Jewish state, so they weren't sort of hiding their intentions, and they wanted on all of the original Palestine mandate, which included what's now Jordan. And they maintained that it will be necessary for this iron wall that John referred to soundly defeat Palestine's Arabs militarily and to make them see there is no alternative. This means preemptive actions, massive retaliation whenever Arabs attack Jews. And they too looked to the imperialist powers, and particularly Great Britain in that time period, as allies, but in a less accommodating manner than the mainstream Zionists. And then the last group, which the rest of my talk will focus on, are what I call the left humanist Zionists. So that's the topic of my book that came out in March of this year, which is Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism. They sometimes allied with the left wing of the socialist labor Zionists. So who were these humanist Zionists that probably most of you had never heard of, and it didn't even occur to you that there was a Zionist movement that was anti-Jewish nation states? Okay, so mostly they were from Central and Eastern Europe. Leading figure was Martin Buber, who espoused what he called a Hebrew humanism, which is why I call them the humanist Zionist. They followed a blend of mostly non-Marxist socialist views and Jewish religious ideals. They were scarred by the devastating impact of nationalism and imperialism in their home countries of Europe, particularly the impact on the Jewish community. And they certainly did not want a Zionism that reinforced these dynamics. Hence, and this might sound surprising, they actually renounced the Balfour Declaration. They did not see the Balfour Declaration as a victory, but as a contradiction of what they thought should be the aspirations of the Zionist movement. Their main institutional voices were Brit Shalom in the 1920s and early 1930s, and then Ichud in the 1940s. They never had a lot of active members, but they had influential figures like Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, who was the founder of Hebrew University, Henrietta Zold, who was the founder of the American women's Zionist group Hadassah, Gershom Scholem, the famous mysticist, and from a distance, Albert Einstein, who I assume you've heard of. So their Zionism, they was looking to the ancient holy Jewish site of Palestine as a base for invigorating Jewish life globally, for reviving Hebrew as a spoken language, and for developing community institutions and practices in the historic homeland of the Jews, informed by the best of Jewish values and outside values. It was also committed to being part of a broader global transformation. So being part of an effort toward a more just and tolerant community that broke from imperialism and nationalism. So it was never insular. They opposed a Jewish nation state because of two reasons. One is it would elevate realpolitik and state interest over Jewish renewal and social justice, and equally importantly to them, it would displace the bulk of Palestine's Arabs. Indeed, Martin Buber identified a just accommodation with Palestine's Arabs as the fundamental challenge or the central test for Zionism if it's going to be something worth struggling for. So to quote Martin Buber, a regenerated Jewish people in Palestine has not only to aim at living peacefully together with the Arab people, but also at a comprehensive cooperation with it in opening and developing the country. So he opposed any kind of separate development, that this needed to be a joint project. The humanist Zionists, then, their political solution was a binational federation of Jews and Arabs in Palestine that combined distinct institutions for each community to realize their own self-determination and joint institutions to govern Palestine collectively and to forge cross-national bonds. So there was an incentive to work together on a better Palestine. Now, of course, they lost out, and so some of you are thinking, okay, kind of interesting, Professor Graubart, but weren't they a lost cause and irrelevant? And my response is, of course, you're wrong, since I wrote a book about them. They, of course, did lose out to the prevailing winds at the time, but they were the only Zionists who offered a program that could accommodate Jewish and Arab self-determination in the same land. The partition plan of 1947, by contrast, was not a compromise. It was a known recipe for war, as recognized by the Anglo-American Commission that was set up in 1946, who agreed with Martin Buber and Judah Magnus that any attempted partition, quote, would result in civil strife, such as might threaten the peace of the world. Indeed, they were correct. The UN partition did not bring about compromise. It triggered war and the ensuing permanent displacement of the majority of the Palestinians, known as the Nakba. The Jewish people did gain a state, but as Hannah Arendt later lamented, this, quote, solution merely produced a new category of refugees, the Arabs. And also, as anticipated by Hannah Arendt and the other humanist Zionists, this new Jewish state of Israel became both militarist and committed to diminishing the Palestinian Arab footprint, both of which have compromised liberal democratic principles, fostered perpetual conflict, regional isolation, and a dependence on outside powers. So my book, just a preview, it does elaborate on lessons, how to engage their views with more contemporary, both Jewish dissenters and Palestinian dissenters. I'll just give a brief preview here of what we can learn from them. I think most importantly is they provide an anchor for a badly needed Jewish reformation on self-determination. So I'm reminded of an interview that the late great Palestinian critical thinker Edward Said had with a prominent Israeli journalist, Ari Shavit, in I think it was 2000. Ari Shavit asked Edward Said if he was demanding that Jews engage in a de-Zionization, like stop being Zionists. And Said said, no, that would be kind of a type of cultural suicide. What I want is a reformation on the meaning and goal of Jewish self-determination in coordination, in dialogue with Palestinian self-determination. So I see that original humanist Zionist vision that Edward Said also applauded, it does provide that anchor. Importantly, it rejected a Zionism that's based, or at least that depends on subjugation and displacement of Palestinians, and insisted that the only Zionism worth striving toward was one that uplifted both the Jewish people and contributed to a better world at large. Another value of the humanist Zionists, and they were saying this at the time, is they identified the foundational pathologies of the prevailing Zionist project sort of set off by Theodor Herzl. One was fixation on an eternal anti-Semitism syndrome. That is, this view that outsiders, Gentiles, will always be hostile toward Jews. That's never going to change, and so we just have to assume the world is always going to hate Jews. Second, related to it, is a fixation on a tribal nationalism. A tribal nationalism is one that rejects any affirmative coexistence with another national group, seeing that it's always going to be the enemy, and that tribal nationalism extended to the international community. And third, what follows is the siege mentality. It's a continuation of the iron wall that Jabotinsky brought up. It's compromise is weakness, be aggressive. So it left no room for any kind of possible peaceful path. Here's Hannah Arendt's powerful warning from 1944 of what to expect from a Jewish state that's forged in conflict and defiance. So to quote her, "The victorious Jews would live surrounded by an entirely hostile Arab population, secluded inside ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense to a degree that would submerge all other interests and activities. The growth of a Jewish culture would cease to be the concern of the whole people. Social experiments would have to be discarded as impractical luxuries. Political thought would center around military strategy." Maybe she was overstating it at the time, but certainly by 2023, her haunting prophecy certainly has come to full fruition. So I end up, my book, and I'll spare the details for now, it ends up with how to do an updated critical Jewish perspective. I think for relevance, particularly, I think one thing that John asked me is, what does it say about coexistence, collaboration with Palestinians? I think one important element is finding a shared purpose for Jews and Palestine Arabs. Not just national self-determination for its own sake, where they are segregated in their own land, but they're part of a broader global project for a more just, sustainable, and tolerant global order, one that breaks free from imperialism, capitalism, and the nation-state system. Importantly, it's no longer just a Jewish idea. It may have been primarily a Jewish idea pre-1948, but over particularly since the 21st century, most of the binationalists now are Palestinians, particularly Palestinian citizens of Israel. And they've assumed a vanguard in terms of pushing for a binational framework. This is now something that would certainly also draw from Palestinian tradition, right? So Palestinian ideas of justice and sympathy for the exile. But that notion of some type of joint transformation of both Palestinian and Jewish ideals that would accommodate national self-determination for both, but not being a zero-sum game. Ultimately, I think that's the only hope if we're ever going to break out of the situation we've been in for 75 plus years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Where is that? I'm Ted Falk. I've been teaching here for about 5 years. I'm a scholar of the Middle East and Islam and Judaism, and I've taught about Palestine, Israel, and I'm a secularist, and I come from a Reform background. But when John asks me to explain Orthodox Judaism and religious Zionism, I'll show up when called. So I'm going to talk about the religious arguments for and against Zionism from the perspective of Orthodoxy and Hasidic and Haredi Judaism in Eastern Europe, the arguments for the settler movement in the West Bank, and the arguments for and against a third temple on the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif. And I'm doing this because it's the first night of Hanukkah, and it's my son's first Hanukkah, and so this is my divine punishment. But I wanted to go to this slide I use in class sometimes, because what are we talking about when we talk about Israel? Because the word changes meanings depending on the context, whether it is the biblical figure and the name Israel, whether it's the children of Israel, whether it's the house of Israel, whether it's the land, or whether it's the state. And I propose that people have different connections to different usages of these terms. And I think one key factor in understanding the settlement movement is that they are more attached to Eretz Yisrael than they are to Medinat Yisrael. There was a very confusing, I think he was called a Luftmensch, a man who lives in the clouds, a dreamer, named Menachem Froman, was one of the founders of the Gush Emunim settler movement. And he also led the only real dialogue after the foundation of Hamas. So he was one of the few Israelis who talked to Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual founder of Hamas, in the 80s. And what Yassin told him was that, Oslo was a mistake because it was your heretics and our heretics making a deal to destroy religion in Palestine, Israel. So by now we're all familiar with these two familiar images of settler violence in the West Bank, the pogrom earlier this year in Hawara, and the presence of extremists like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir in the most desperate of Netanyahu governments. So where did we get here from? Where did religious Zionism come from if it began as a political project, whether secular or socialist? How did religious Jews, Torah-observant Jews, get involved and have their political awakening? So the area of the Russian Empire, what is now Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and most of Ukraine and Moldova, this was the area called the Pale of Settlement, where Jews in the Russian Empire were allowed to live, ranging between 10 and 20% of the population, depending on the region. And this time period, first the 1700s with the Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment, and then the 1800s with the emergence of all the isms, nationalism, communism, socialism, liberalism, Zionism. Those were a profoundly threatening force for the Orthodox hierarchy in Eastern Europe, both Hasidic Haredi, as well as the Misnagdim, the Jews based principally in Lithuania who were hostile to Hasidic Judaism. So they were trying to figure out, how do we deal with these new challenging phenomena of democracy or these challenging ideas, and young Jewish people who wanted to learn secular sciences rather than studying Torah. And onto this scene are a father and son, the rabbi's cook. He is a very fascinating figure. He's born in what is now Latvia. He's an early advocate of vegetarianism. He would only eat meat on the Sabbath and during commanded feast days. And he is the one who can square the circle, who can attempt to reconcile the secular or socialist political Zionism with religious observance. He believes at the same time that labor Zionism is a false ideology distracting from the Torah. He questions, is it a sin to immigrate to Palestine before the arrival of the Messiah? And this is a key component in how Orthodox Jews reckon with the Zionist project. But he has this kind of fundamental belief of Kol Yisrael, that Jews are responsible for each other. And so he didn't want to leave those who were immigrating to be apart from the people, B'nai Yisrael. And he saw it as a duty to meet them where they were and guide them back to the path of religious observance. And he said that secular Zionism was the unwitting agent of the Messiah, that they thought they were going there to build a socialist state, but really they were going there to prepare the way for the Messianic era. And so he was saying that they don't realize it, but they were guided by God to do this preparatory work to build secularly and then sanctify when the time came. On the other hand, there were many who opposed him, who thought that collaborating with the secular Zionist movement would only lead to corruption of religion. Probably most notably are the Satmar Hasids, originating from what is now Hungary. And the previous Satmar Rebbe, the head rabbi of the movement, they're dynastic, said even if every Israeli politician were holy, it would still be a rebellion against God to attempt to establish a Jewish state without a Messiah leading there. Another group that tends to suck up a lot of the oxygen in pro-Palestine spaces are the Neturei Karta, who have a wild, to put that mildly, set of beliefs. They are a fringe group of maybe a few thousand people in Israel and the West. And they believe that the diaspora is divine punishment. So it's not that Jews shouldn't have a state, it's that they are still being punished. They also believe that the Holocaust was divine punishment. They also believe that gay pride parades cause hurricanes. So I would caution you to avoid giving them too much attention. So the elder Rav Kook dies in the 1930s, and his son Zvi Yehuda approaches the Zionist movement and the project pragmatically. That he believed in this redemptive process, that first Jews would establish control of the land, and then there was still the debate, does that include Jordan and southern Syria and southern Lebanon and Sinai? And once that was achieved, they could go about constructing the third temple, resuming animal sacrifices that had been discontinued in 70 of the Common Era, bringing about the Messianic age. This was itself controversial because in the view of, say, the Orthodox and Hasidic majority, the Messianic age would be brought about by holiness, that by following the Torah, following the 613 commandments, that is what will bring the Messiah, not by human hands will it be built. So the idea of humans building the third temple is anathema to many Orthodox groups who, like the Lubavitchers, the people who run the Chabad, who believe that the temple is already constructed in heaven, and it's just a matter of people being good and doing good, and that on the designated moment, God will bring it down. And his career, and he becomes the spiritual leader. His students go on to found the Gush Emunim settler movement, is definitely shaped by the Six-Day War in 1967. because what he told his students is that the founders of Israel, Ben Gurion, both the labor Zionists as well as the revisionists, he said that they had sinned by abandoning Hebron, Al-Khalil, Nablus, Shechem, and Jericho. And so the Israeli victory in 1967 was proof to Rav Kook the Younger that God had chosen Israel, and God wanted Israel to be, the state, Medinat Yisrael, to be victorious. And this is part of what prompts the settler movement, is he encourages his followers to move to the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan for multiple reasons. One, because it's a good deed, a commandment to go into the land and settle it. And the other was political, that once you have established yourself, it will be difficult to remove or politically impossible for future Israeli government. The conquest of Jerusalem in particular, but also Hebron, Al-Khalil, brought many other Israelis closer to religious observance. The old city itself and the return to the Western Wall. So a question I get a lot is, why do settlers want to live next to people who they think hate them? And that goes into those extra commandments that are in the Christian scriptures or in the Hebrew scriptures, but not counted the same way as they are in the Hebrew scriptures. And so this is a logic that's playing by a different set of rules. It's not based on pragmatic politics. It's based on divine commandments. In Deuteronomy, see, I have placed the land before you. Go and take possession of the land which the Lord, Adonai, swore to give your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and their descendants after them. Be fruitful and multiply, in Genesis. So those two things work together in the settler movement. One is that they feel they are commanded to live in the whole of historic Palestine. The other is be fruitful and multiply. They don't practice birth control. And in a difficult housing market in Israel, these very large Orthodox families, whether religious Zionist or Haredi, who are even non-Zionist, if you have 4, 5, 6 kids, you can afford a much larger place in a settlement than you can in Jerusalem or Haifa or God forbid, Tel Aviv. And so the Gush Emanim said, okay, by following the commandments, by going into the land, by possessing it, they will hasten the arrival of the Messiah and bring on the Messianic age. And at the same time, by establishing these settlements, especially in close vicinity to major Palestinian cities, they will make it more difficult for future governments of Israel to do the land for peace deal. So the first test of this was they established settlements in Sinai that were forcibly dismantled during the Camp David Accords between Menachem Begin and Sadat in the late 70s. This was also tested in the unilateral disengagement of the Sharon government in 2005, in which a little over 9,000 Israelis in settlements in Gaza were forcibly removed, and this collapsed Sharon's government. So the presence of 600,000 settlers in the West Bank is designed to prevent a two-state solution. That Menachem Froman, who said he would prefer to live as a religious Jew in a Palestinian state, I think those types of figures are few and far between. So the numbers vary. It's somewhere between 600 and 700,000 if you combine the West Bank and the Golan Heights, which was officially annexed by Israel. Another religious figure who plays a crucial role in the settler movement, but especially around the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif, was the military rabbi, Shlomo Goren. He goes on to become chief rabbi of Jaffa, and then chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Israel. And so he's the first to the Western Wall in 1967, where he blows the shofar, and he reads Psalm 122, I rejoiced with those who said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And he wants to blow up the Dome of the Rock. And he sees the war as his opportunity to do so, to the point that he says, go down in history, tomorrow might be too late. His commanding officer, Uzi Narkis, says that I'm going to lock you up in military jail if you keep talking about this. This will cause a riot or a catastrophic regional war that Israel is not prepared for. He recalls talking to Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, and said, do you really think we should have blown it up? He said, certainly. It's a tragedy for generations we did not do so. He returned, so this is him inside the Dome of the Rock. He attempts to lead prayers on the Temple Mount later that summer after the conquest, but the military government doesn't want riots on their hands, so they prevent him, and that's the tenuous status quo that Jews pray at the Western Wall, Muslims pray on the Temple Mount itself, tourists can visit but cannot pray. And that has been undermined by the current extremist government that would like to build a third temple and resume animal sacrifice, as was practiced in temple Judaism. Later in the early 80s, he uses an archaeological dig at the Western Wall to attempt to tunnel under the Dome of the Rock. He and another rabbi claim that they saw the Ark of the Covenant there. Who knows? So more or less, he attempted to tunnel from here underneath, and then before his project was shut down. But if you're in Jerusalem, you see this warning. It is forbidden for any person to enter the area of the Temple Mount due to its sacredness. But nevertheless, both Jews and non-Jews do visit as tourists. And the tenuous status quo is that non-Muslims can visit. It's under the control of the Jordanian Waqf that oversees the charity. They can enter Al-Aqsa, but cannot enter the Dome of the Rock or pray there. For his part, the elder Rav Kook said Jews should not go to the place of the temple until the Messiah is present. Just a bit of linguistic parallels that in Hebrew it's known as Beit HaMikdash. In Arabic, and one of the sources of the name of the Arabic name of Jerusalem is Beit al-Muqaddas. It's also where the surname Maqdisi comes from. So why would Jews be banned from going to the Temple Mount? That has to do with the era of Temple Judaism versus Rabbinic Judaism or study. And that is that there was a priestly caste that was limited to a certain patrilineal line of Kohanim, and only they were permitted to enter the Kodesh HaKodashim, or the Sanctum Sanctorum, holiest of holies. So if there is no temple there, and we don't know where the holiest of holies was, then it would be a sin to step on what is a prohibited space, even accidentally. Most archaeologists associate it with the foundation stone, the rock in the Dome of the Rock. The damage to it was mostly done by crusaders, not Muslims or Jews. But again, the status quo of saying we should not go there lest we accidentally sin has been undermined in recent years by the religious Zionist movement, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and his coalition partner Smotrich. And they staged these kind of provocations, showing up with heavy security, kind of asking for a fight, and attempting to carry out prayers contravening the status quo agreement. There's a whole temple institute that has models of the temple that they hope to construct there. There are far-fetched plans that the Dome of the Rock could just be relocated. They also are attempting to carry out various elements of the Hebrew scriptures, such as breeding red heifers, specifically for the purpose of sacrifice. And there have been incidents in the last 6 months of people getting stopped attempting to bring sheep or goats to the Temple Mount to carry out animal sacrifices. So essentially, they're kind of weighing two different commandments. One is the commandment to not step foot into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and the other is the commandment to do animal sacrifices at the temple. And so they're just saying, well, that one is more important in the grand scheme of things. So I want to end by playing clips of two songs, and kind of building on what Jonathan had said about kind of building a future together, and a model of living beyond the nation state. The first is sung by Shuli Natan, but it's written by Naomi Shemer. It was written as it was written to be the Israeli national anthem, but it wasn't accepted. And this became a very popular song in 1967 after the conquest of Jerusalem. And so the soldiers sang it as they entered the Western Wall area, the Kotel. And the other is a song by Feiruz, the Lebanese singer from the same period, who has a number of songs about Jerusalem. But this one is I think, reflects the pain as well as the religious significance for both Muslims and Christians, in addition to Jews. Stop there. It's a long song. And I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and it's not time for psychedelic Turkish music, sorry. And I will give way to Rico. Thank you.
How do I put that outline part up? Okay. Okay, so follow and drag over, but with the outline.
Do you want this up there? Yeah.
Yeah, just so we can follow along. All right, so I'll just close that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. All right. So Christian Zionism is basically Christianity that follows all of the subtler biblical passages that Ted was just talking about. Thank you. I'm done. Anyway, no. I wish I could be done. In a certain way, I was thinking about this panel, and we're kind of in reverse order of a going from a hopefulness that Jonathan gave us to increasingly intractable problems from what I'll just flat out say is, or what I call bad theology, both the types of Jewish theology that Ted was outlining, and then, but especially the Christian theology I'll be talking about. Perhaps a couple more jokes before I go. Now, we get into the dark stuff. I will say first that I'm going to be, a little bit irreverent, in part because I was brought up in this. And so, of course, when you're brought up in something and you turn to realize it was all a bunch of deception, you can feel a certain right to harshly criticize. But I also feel the responsibility to say, hashtag not all evangelicals. In other words, while I'm about to describe, what I'm about to describe is very, very prominent amongst evangelical Protestants in the United States, and that's being exported elsewhere. It is not everybody, right? Just like Judaism, and just like even Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, which I'm a part of, evangelical Protestantism is not a monolith. Nevertheless, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And it's extremely dominant. Okay? So the goals of my presentation today are really to lay out, first of all, to explain what Christian Zionism is, and as I have it there, how it is arguably a form of pro-Israel anti-Semitism. I will start off just then, demonstrating the irreverence I was talking about, in the sense that if I were to really just boil down this theology, it works like this. Israel was prophesied by God to be reformed as a nation state. It must be reformed as a nation state in order to build the third temple. It requires Christians and America to support it, lest we invite destruction upon ourselves, like the hurricanes Ted was talking about with it. Instead of it being a fringe group, it is a mainstream idea with this group. And the reason why I say it's pro-Israel anti-Semitism is the reason why the nation state of Israel has to exist, be supported, and rebuild the third temple is to bring about Armageddon, the end of the world, the return of Jesus Christ, who will then have about 144,000 Jewish people realize he was the Messiah all along, convert, and the rest will burn in hell forever. I don't know what can be really more anti-Semitic than that. I mean, I guess there's some things that can be in the running, but that one's definitely up there, right? 144,000 of you will be good when you change your mind, and the rest, toast. Literally. All right, so, but I'll delve a little more into and give it a more nuance of how it works, because I think it's important for people to understand how it works in order to be able to combat it. Because really, honestly, that's how I came out of this upbringing, indoctrination, full elementary school and high school education, where it was drummed into me, as so much so that I did not even understand there were other types of Christianity that thought otherwise. Okay? And this is how a huge chunk, we'll get to this in a bit, but a huge chunk of Americans live. So I'm going to also try and summarize the theology and history that gave rise to it. I hope to illuminate how problematic this is from a Christian theological and religious studies perspective, or perspectives, I guess I should say, and then to demonstrate its pernicious effects on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, including issues beyond Israeli crimes and Palestinian rights, such as the ecological crisis. Let me say that again, just back up. Israeli governmental crimes and Palestinian rights, such as the ecological crisis, and also just fomenting hostilities towards countries like Russia, China, groups like Muslims, and so forth. So, how's this go? So, a key verse, maybe the most key verse to Christian Zionism, is taking this passage from Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And Genesis 12, 1 through 3 says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." I'm going to highlight the key line in case you miss. "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you." Okay. This verse is interpreted by Christian Zionists as meaning not just like this promise to Abraham here, okay, who it applies to the modern nation state of Israel created in 1948. In other words, anyone who supports unconditionally that nation state will be blessed, and anyone who opposes it or criticizes it will be cursed. Like the hurricanes again. Okay. So where did this stuff come from? I personally, having been raised in it, was shocked when I discovered that this type of Christian theology is really no older than the Church of Latter-day Saints or Mormonism. In other words, it's a new religious movement, relatively speaking. It arose in the 19th century, in the 1800s, with a man named John Nelson Darby and what is called dispensationalist theology. Okay? John Nelson Darby, somewhere around, he lived from 1800 to 1882. Somewhere around 1830, he founded a group known as the Plymouth Brethren, a new denomination in England. And there's conflicting reports of all of his various sources of how he formed his theology, but some of them even include the reports that he was listening to what they called a sleeping prophet, a woman who would routinely speak in her sleep about religious matters, and he would jot these things down as authoritative ways of interpreting the Bible. In any case, regardless of whether that is actually the origin or not of his dispensationalist idea, Darby was in one way trying to correct, I don't know if that's his goal, but he was correcting something that was actually a major problem in the history of Christianity and Christianity's anti-Semitism problem, namely what is called supersessionist theology. In other words, supersessionist theology, which is dominant in, and as John was mentioning, this came up a lot in the Jewish-Christian dialogues that I was a part of, but supersessionist theology is the theology that was dominant amongst the Catholic and Orthodox and also mainline Protestant circles for a long time, that Christianity is basically the replacement or the new Israel. Okay? And naturally, that led to, that has a dark history of, the connection to pogroms, to all sorts of Good Friday violence throughout the Middle Ages and onward. So supersessionist theology is a problem, but dispensationalist theology is an example of trying to correct a problem by creating at least as big a problem. Dispensation, right, in this sense, a lot of themes in this actually remind me of themes in Ted's talk. You gotta say Ted's talk. It's on TED Talk. Right? But dispensationalist theology has this idea that you have a God that is underlying. It's almost like a God who changes his mind in the way he deals with people, just at different periods of history. So in other words, there's an initial dispensation of the way God relates to and judges people from, say, Adam and Eve to Noah. Okay? And then, after that, he has a new way of relating to people, okay? Especially after the law is given to Moses. Now people are judged by the law. Then, after that, you get it's way too complicated and unimportant here to go into here. But then you get the Jesus, right? Jesus comes along and you have a new dispensation. But it's a very short one. In other words, dispensationalist theology is really curious in that it actually renders most of Jesus' sayings irrelevant to current Christians. In other words, the argument is that in dispensationalist theology, that when a lot of the things Jesus has to say are actually referring to the older dispensation of Moses and the law, or other things Jesus has to say are actually referring to the future when this kind of Armageddon situation I was describing a moment ago finally happens. Okay? So, for example, a passage that is particularly significant in the Bible, Matthew 25, often known as the parable of the sheep and the goats, is a very famous passage in which Jesus commands his followers, or describes the last judgment, saying that the basis of the last judgment is how you cared for the poor, the hungry, the needy, that you care for those that were in prison, etc. Okay? According to dispensationalist theology, that would be works righteousness. And of course, for Christians today, all you have to do, for this type of theology, all you have to do is believe in Jesus and you're good to go. Once saved, always saved is a slogan of this type of Christianity. Okay? These are those big, stadium harvest crusades, etc., where they just try to get you to get down there and pray the prayer and accept Jesus into your heart. And at that point, you could basically, according to a lot of the versions of this, you can be the most awful person in the world, and you're still saved. Meanwhile, everybody else is still going to hell. Okay? Because the parable of the sheep and the goats, in this case, is not referring to, that can't be referring to this dispensation. In this dispensation, you just need to allow Jesus into your heart. However, once the situation of the third temple is built, there will be a rapture. Okay? The rapture is this idea that basically the Christians who currently believe the right way, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and mainline Protestants, are usually excluded from this and will be left behind for the torment like everybody else. It's talking about the future dispensation once all this stuff goes down, And instead of the poor and the hungry and the needy and those in prison being, well, that, it's actually that in the future dispensation, the only people that have any chance of being saved besides the 144,000 Jews that I was talking about a moment ago are the people who take care of poor, hungry, and needy Jewish people during that future dispensation. Okay? Are you following this here? Like, God almost like kind of has a multiple personality disorder in this. He like has totally, he's like, okay, this is how you're a good person, and this, oh, now that one's over, this is how you're like one of my people. Oh, now that's over, this is how you're one of my people. Oh, now that's over, this is how you're one of, and this is like the, I mean, if you hadn't put 2 and 2 together yet, it's arguably partly why Christians today can feel such license to just be proud of what they believe and then like live out virtually very little of what Jesus taught. Okay. Now, so how did this become popular in the U.S.? Okay, it started with this little group. Most of you probably never even heard of the Plymouth Brethren. I've only personally met someone who was part of the Plymouth Brethren once. It's still a very small denomination. After the Civil War, Darby did not get much traction in England. But after the Civil War, some of his followers came to the U.S., and in the devastation of the American Civil War, which kind of felt like a post-apocalyptic landscape, this message of an impending return to a state of God coming back and saving us from all of this, caught on a bit. And it eventually really took off with what is called the Scofield Reference Bible that was published in 1909. It was a Bible that went around, and people like distributed it, evangelical groups like put it gave it away for free and so forth, and it had all the scholarly makings of the thing that tricks people into thinking this way, that this is just what the Bible has to say. Instead of actually paying attention to the way it was mixing together genres of the Bible. Okay, this is why, again, advertisement. This is why theology and religious studies are important. Okay, the different texts of the Bible, Genesis, is a particular genre of literature. Okay, 1 Thessalonians is a letter from St. Paul to a particular community 2,000 years ago. The book of Revelation is who knows what, okay? But this type of theology just like takes all of it and mishmashes these verses together and comes up with this system, okay? And that's what the Scofield Reference Bible did. Now, it really then takes off in 1970 when Hal Lindsey writes this book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which makes a lot of, and it was even then made into a movie narrated by Orson Welles, which really starts to popularize this stuff. Okay? And in popularizing it, it also used this passage from the book of Ezekiel about just vague references to Gog and Magog, which are also referenced again in the book of Revelation, as the great enemies of Israel that will invade, and then the Messiah will have to return and fight them off in the Great War, in the Armageddon. Okay? Now, Gog and Magog were to the north. Just vaguely to the north? Well, Cold War, what do you get in Hal Lindsey? Oh, Gog and Magog are the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is going to invade Israel. This will bring about the end of the world. The Messiah will have to come back and so forth. Okay? This reached a high point at Edgar Whisenant's book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988, published in 1988. That one didn't pan out well. Okay? But his reasoning was that the foretelling of Israel, he takes certain verses from the New Testament, that Israel will, once the nation state was formed, that this took this passage of Jesus where he says, this generation will not pass away until all things like come to take place. And when that then gets interpreted as in Jewish, gets interpreted that because in a lot of Hebrew scriptures and so forth, a generation is 40 years. 1948, the foundation of Israel. 40 years later, 1988. Okay, well, it didn't pan out. Okay, now what do we do? Well, it's because the third temple wasn't built yet. The third temple will be built, and then it'll be 40 years. Okay, so now you get like an infinite delay that you can do. Plus, you also have a rotating villain of Gog and Magog. It becomes then China once the Soviet Union falls apart. Then it becomes like Bin Laden and like the Al-Qaeda network. Then it becomes, and so on. I guarantee you, I'm not plugged into those circles right now. I guarantee you Hamas is like a stand-in right now. Okay, and so anyhow, just to jump ahead, like Moody Bible, because I'm out of time here, I think, but Moody Bible Institute also helped popularize this stuff. Some of you may remember Tim LaHaye and the Left Behind book series that were bestsellers that made this into fiction. Okay? Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and their extensive television and education networks. Right? Jerry Falwell is the founder of Liberty University. Pat Robertson of the 700 Club. They have huge influence through this. This bleeds into Pentecostal circles, even some Catholic and Orthodox circles. Biola University, it's an article of faith there. According to a recent Pew Research poll, something like 40% of Americans believe in something like this. That affects public policy in major ways and has affected public policy in major ways. John, do I have time to play a video of Robertson and Falwell talking? 2 minutes? Let me see if it's worth it.
This way we can leave time for questions.
Actually, I'll just summarize what they had to say. So after 9/11, Falwell and Robertson are talking about why 9/11 happened, and they literally said that they blame the gays and the feminists and the abortionists and the ACLU and the People for the American Way and all of these, and the list goes on and on, okay? Basically everything liberal, because if you didn't know, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson are basically the founders of the religious right, to give you a further sense also of how Christian Zionism and that voting bloc fit together. But yeah, they argued 9/11 happened because of those. Going back again to the hurricane anecdote from Ted, 9/11 happened because we let because we, I forgot, school prayer. We kicked God out of the schools. So what else does this do? What it means at the end of the day is that for these Christians, Israel can do no wrong. It must be supported no matter what, or America will suffer another thing like 9/11 or far worse. Okay? It means a lack of care for the ecological crisis, nuclear war, poverty issues, because anything, it doesn't matter. Within 5 years, it's always this case, within 5 years, all these prophecies are going to come to pass, the rapture is going to happen, and this is all going to end. So why care about the earth? Why care about poverty? Why care about any other political issues? Okay? In fact, it causes many people to become eager to see escalation in the current war right now because they believe that this will then force Jesus to come back and take the side of Israel before burning most of them. Okay? It leads people to be anti the UN, as the UN has been seen as the harbinger of the anti the EU. But at the end of the day, what I want to end with is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you have that kind of political approach and you create policies along those lines, you then allow the ecological crisis and the possibility of nuclear war, and the situation of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that put us to become something that we are now on the cusp of. And I don't have any answers for you other than to say, this again is why education about this stuff in our universities is important. Because for people to understand and put these things in context and realize that this is not the way that the Bible needs to be read, and have a massive impact in helping people drop the scales from their eyes and actually see what's going on for what it is. Thank you.
Thank you all for such an insightful talk. I'm going to sit with you for just a second. I'm going to open it up to questions, but maybe I'd like to raise the first question. Thank you all for depressing us so heavily, especially the Christian Zionism talk.
I have a joke that maybe I can balance it with later.
Can you all hear me, or is this okay, Mr. Knight? Use the mic. Okay, is this working? No, it's not working. It's working now? Yeah, okay. I kind of like to maybe begin the question process by asking what a post-Zionist future looks like for Palestine and Israel. And is that even possible? I think your talks today sort of give us the sense of the deep entrenchment of this idea of a militarist Zionism, whether it's through a Christian lens or through kind of all of these religious settler movements, or even the militarist movement, and maybe even like the humanist movement that somehow went and lived in Israel and became part of the process, or maybe from the Palestinian perspective, part of the problem. Is there a possibility for a post-Zionist future? Is that something that we can envision? And how do we begin to envision that or even work towards that possibility? It's not working?
This one isn't either. Try turning it on. That one as we.
I have no idea.
Someone gets it fixed.
Sorry, I have technical problems. Is it working? Yeah.
Okay, well, that is my big concern about what would an appealing future look like. So it's part of what I still write about is neither the typical one-state thing of just focusing on equality, democracy, right? Not that I'm against any of those things. None of those quite get to deeply felt national self-determination and attachment of both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs to essentially the same land. The two-state, the main problem with two-state resolutions is not only that it's been constantly undermined in part by settlements and Israeli policies making it really logistically difficult, but it's focused so much on somehow these two groups just can't coexist, and so you have to cordon them off. You still got that confusing element. There would still be 20% or so within the state of Israel that would not be Jewish, that would be Palestinian. So I think what's the ideal is somehow you need a situation that certainly does take equality, democracy, rights seriously, but accommodates distinct autonomy, self-determination for both Jews and for Palestinian Arabs. And it's going to require the two groups to both come up with a reckoning of just years of Israeli subjugation and displacement of Palestinians, but then the willingness of both Israelis and Palestinians to have a shared future that involves both distinct autonomy, where they kind of work out their own direction, and collective collaboration. And all of those are really daunting tasks. You could certainly see the appeal maybe of two states of just an utter divorce. It's just the two-state thing has really ran out of steam also. And I don't think there's any getting around that. Somehow you need first a reckoning of just what Zionism wrought upon the Palestinians. But beyond that, you then need a recognition that neither of these two peoples are going away. They both have distinct self-determination aspirations, but they also both need to collaborate. Part of it is understanding the traumas. So from the Palestinian case, understanding the Holocaust and other aspects of deep anti-Semitism toward Jews over history, but then certainly for Jews, just understanding the Nakba and exile. None of that's daunting. I mean, none of that's undaunting, so none of that's easy to imagine anytime soon, but ultimately I don't see any alternative. Otherwise, you're just getting this constant, quote, managing of the conflict where the death toll, particularly for Palestinians, just keeps going up.
Yeah, I tend to agree that any possible solution very far down the road will probably revolve around some kind of communal autonomy and devolved institutions. But I think the real obstacle to that is trust building. Palestinian right to life, liberty, and property. So it's one thing to say, we'll each have our own institutions, but you have to trust that your rights and your rights will be respected even in this devolved kind of hyphenate system. I sometimes compare it to like a very unhappy marriage that just can't end. That Jerusalem will always be Arab and Jerusalem will always be Israeli. They're inextricably linked, both for geographic reasons, for economic reasons, but for also deeply spiritual and national reasons. So I think you're absolutely right that there has to be a real reckoning with the occupation and with militarism and the resolution to figure out a way to live alongside one another, if not together.
I want to add one ray of hope. Now, I'm the hopeful person here. Is near the end of my book, I point to this movement. It is for a confederation. It's called A Land for All. It's made up of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs who are actually sitting down trying to work out what this vision would look like. And part of it is just getting to know each other and kind of their traumas and their aspirations, but it is kind of slowly thinking about what these would look like. It's true it's a small minority in both communities, but that's the only element I think that can work for this appealing post-future.
While my talk was undoubtedly the most depressing, as John mentioned, I think, I said a lot of things about this last week with the idea of the no-state solution. I don't want to necessarily repeat that here, but I think and again, this will be a long grind. None of these things can happen just overnight, but in an era of globalization and so forth, it increasingly, like religious and cultural chauvinism just across the board, regardless of where we're talking about, need to disappear. And we need to embrace the kinds of, if we think of if redeeming anything about Zionism, how should I put it? First of all, both me and my wife were raised in this, and we're able to shake it off. Okay, and I guess I'll give the example through the joke I was planning to make earlier, which is that as converts to Eastern Orthodoxy, and my wife is ethnically Ashkenazi, my kids are kind of the luckiest kids around in that they get a visit from St. Nicholas yesterday on Feast of St. Nicholas. They're starting celebration of Hanukkah tonight, and then St. Nicholas will come again on December 25th. So They luck out over all the other kids around them. And it's a, you know, it's a humorous curiosity, but I also think this is like the future. Like, in other words, the more we can actually build interreligious dialogue and interreligious and intercultural transference and learning from each other and cross-pollination, and just like we as a species did technologically, like Jared Diamond talks about in his Guns, Germs, and Steel, that it's because people share technological ideas, the Eurasian landmass advanced. I feel that spiritually, the more that we can drop religious and cultural chauvinism and learn from each other's like ways and paths towards what it means to be human, the more that we have a chance to kind of bring both of these things together.
We're going to open it up for question, but I just maybe want to share a thought that evangelical Christianity has some redeeming value in many ways. And I think of Jimmy Carter, for example, who grew up and is still very much a practicing evangelical Christian and still sees the humanities of the Palestinian and has worked a fair bit at doing it without rejecting the idea of Israel.
In fact, on that note, the Palestinian priest I worked with for 2 years in New York gave out Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, to everyone in the community as a free gift at Christmas time. So, yeah.
Well, I'll take one of the microphones and I'll happily go over there. Is this one working for you all?
No.
That one is dead? All right. You keep this and they're going to scream. You're not going to repeat or summarize the question so that it can go to camera. So this gentleman back there, please.
I would see it for the two-state, one-state, no-state presentation. My question at that time, I'm going to repeat it, should the United States go to the United Nations, recognize an independent Palestinian state with borders in Palestine, and ask for a UN peace mandate of U.S.-led NATO forces to maintain the peace in Palestine?
I don't think these territories can be gerrymandered into two states, no matter how creative you get with drawing lines on a map. And as I said last week, I don't think the United States, as part of any coalition, has the credibility to be that neutral actor.
I'm calling for total separation. In other words, for the Jews that would be living in a Palestinian state, they got to move. For the non-Jews living in a Jewish state, they have to move. In other words, both states would be just for each other. And Jerusalem, my suggestion was make it an international city because of the confluence of the three monolithic religions. So nobody gets it for that.
I'm going to give an answer that's not as negative. It's a different take, but you might actually find it interesting. There was a New Yorker interview with Nathan Thrall. It's one of those Isaac Chotiner where he interviews people, and Nathan Thrall, it was oddly optimistic. He wrote this great book that just came out earlier this year, A Day in the Life of Abu Salama, and so he's been touring the United States. And he was asked in the New Yorker, you said in the past that it doesn't make sense to call for one state, two states. It's just so grim. Nothing's going to work if you just kind of think about the nature of Israeli political society, or for that matter, even Palestinian political society. But he said actually, since October 7th, so you might find this interesting if you haven't read that interview, he said, one thing that the October 7th events have sort of brought home, in a sense, he argues at least, to both Israelis and to the Americans, is your hope that the Palestinians could just be managed, right? Occasional mowing the lawn, is that really came undone with the October 7th event. So Thrall actually did say, even though he knows it's a long shot, he did say something close to what you're saying, that maybe now if the U.S. sees that you can't ignore the Palestinian situation, and while the United States has generally been destructive, really, toward bringing about the old global consensus of two-state, what if the United States now said, kind of turned on a dime, and granted this is a long shot, is, okay, we're calling out the parameters. It's got to be two states based on the 1967 borders with maybe some very small... yeah, I'm just saying what Nathan Thrall is saying. So based on the 1967 borders, that if the United States actually changed its tune, since it's long been the chief obstacle toward achieving the old two-state consensus, that could still produce some momentum. I actually, well, I don't think the United States is going to do that anytime soon, given the nature of U.S. politics. If one sort of thought down the line, if there's kind of hope that slowly American public opinion is changing, the U.S. still could make a difference if its views change. It's probably not happening anytime soon, but something along what Nathan Thrall is talking about, that we would need a really big change from the United States because it's been the biggest obstacle toward a global consensus, even along the two-state. That would be the way to go.
We got the microphone working, so other questions, I'll bring you the mic.
Yeah, sure.
I would disagree only because I think that would be political suicide for any Israeli politician to ask 400,000 settlers in the West Bank, 200,000 in East Jerusalem, to leave what they believe is their biblically promised land. Sharon lost his own party in 2005, 2006 for removing 9,000 people. So I think the 1967, I don't think they can go back to the 1967 borders.
The only quick thing I would add to that is that, like, again, I'd love to share Jonathan's hope, but I also think Jonathan, just from what I've heard in his talk and what I know, would largely agree with what I'm going to say is that the nation-state model, which I was talking about last week, is part of the problem in the first place. But I think even more deeply, the idea of ethno-states is a massive problem. Right? The idea of states that belong to a particular ethnicity or a particular religion is something that just inherently is going to lead, it will not be a solution at the end of the day.
Anybody have questions?
Yeah, is this working? Hi, thank you so much for your really informative discussions today. It's in the spirit of hope that I asked this question. I want to push John's line of inquiry a little further in thinking through the possibilities of autonomous self-determination and the ability to imagine other ways of relating and being in the world and with one another. And my question is this: what role does theology play in this reimagining, or might it play? And I think Rico was taking us down that line of inquiry and thinking about, well, what is good theology in this case, right, versus a bad theology?
I'll start with that. So I write about Martin Buber. Buber was not he certainly was not an Orthodox Jew in terms of his own rituals and observations, but he was very influenced by Hebrew teaching. In fact, the elder Rabbi Kook was one of his inspirations. So he was thinking that there is a way to think about the Jewish theological spirit as it is calling for holy cultivation, justice. And, you could point to others like Abraham Joshua Heschel. I used to work at Tikkun magazine. There was Michael Lerner. So there's an element of kind of a Jewish liberation theology, I guess we could say, roughly speaking. So I think part of it, so this is just from the Jewish end, is drawing from a mix. So part of it is the appealing Jewish theological elements that don't see it as kind of a zero-sum apocalyptic game, but see it as part of fulfilling the Jewish covenant is having this higher element. Like Buber was very critical of Theodor Herzl for just reducing it to kind of a secular national that lacked any kind of spirit. So that element, I think, would have to be part of it within the Jewish tradition. I'll let others speak about theology from Christianity or Islam.
I'll just add that the elder Rav Kook actually had a positive understanding of Islam, especially as compared to Christianity, which he regarded as fundamentally polytheistic. He said, well, Muslims are monotheists who believe in the same God. There's these overlaps in kashrut and halal. We can live alongside them because they're not drawing us into polytheism like these horrible Christians.
I guess, beyond the sort of kind of interreligious or collaborative thing that I was talking about, drawing out further why, say, biblical studies and theology and historical context and so forth are kind of, to me, like crucial to getting people to recenter on what may be some of like the most humanitarian kind of values of a religion. As I was saying earlier, I kind of joked that the book of Revelation is a like, well, who knows what's going on there. Actually, I don't believe that at all. That was more of a just kind of joke in terms of the sense of how it's been used over the centuries, not just starting with Darby, but even with other types of millenarian movements and apocalyptic movements, none of which ever have any, like the impending end of the world like kind of thing just always tends to yield some really unfortunate results. But what I was going to say is that, like, for example, when I say like that the book of Revelation actually is rather comprehensible, if people do, like, there's more or less a biblical scholars consensus that something like 666, which you ask, I often ask my students, like, what is it? They say, oh, it's the devil's number, right? Or maybe more specific, the Antichrist number or something like that. Well, most people know that, like, there's variant manuscripts, one that says 666, one that says 616. 616 is not as catchy, right? But the prevailing theory is that in, like, Greek or in Latin alternately, if you translate Nero Caesar into, like, Hebrew numerology, the way, like, David goes into, like, the number 14, you find that it was actually code at the time to Christians about a monstrous person, right? And that you educate people that is something that, like, the book of Revelation is not some, like, book of, like, future history. It's a metaphorical kind of kaleidoscopic view of now and the problems that face us now. And the kind of, like, compassion and welcoming and charitability and unconditional, like, love for other people that is its command, like, in its opening chapters, and that it circles back around to at the end. And this, again, is just a short, as I can do right now, version of, like, how understanding that even then connecting that with 1 John, which talks about many antichrists will come. Suddenly now you have a thing to, instead of, like, looking for this, like, end of the world moment, you understand that, like, humanity is always in this spiritual battle against what we might call the demonic, which is actually, if you link it back again to that no one can buy or sell without accepting the mark. Like, there's lots of ways in which you can look at, like, that referring to just our contemporary problem of a extremely demonic and unjust economic system.
Thanks to all of you for these really interesting talks. I just wanted to say I was brought up in a fundamentalist group and still have many, many relatives in the same group, and we were dispensationalists. And so all of these relatives think that the rapture is imminent, and they all hold similar beliefs about what, we should support Israel and whatever Israel does to bring about the rapture. I ended up leaving the church when I was 18. I was lucky because there were no fundamentalist schools at the time. This was back in the 60s and 70s. And so I was sent to public school, and in effect that saved me. I went to a public university. I wasn't supposed to go to university at all, but I talked the church elders into it because they thought it would translate for the church if I could get, a university education. So I was allowed to go to university. And I was in this university, 32,000 students. I thought, how could all of these people be going to hell, and I alone am going to be saved, right? But I see now members of my family with little children, they're not sending them to public schools. They're sending them to private fundamentalist schools. There's a trend towards homeschooling. There's a tendency not to go to university or college because the idea of the rapture is imminent. Why go to college, right? The Lord is going to come, take us all up, So I'm just wondering, it's kind of saddening to think that 40% of the U.S. population believes this stuff. And I'm just wondering if it isn't less hopeful now than it ever has been, that people are going to end up leaving, splitting off from these groups.
I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, right? Like even in preparing for this panel and checking on what the most recent polls said, I was rather dismayed to see how high the number was. I was actually thinking it would be somewhere more around a third. And in fact, it may be, I'd have to go back and look, but it may be that it's actually risen from something like a third to 40%. The withdrawal from education and so forth definitely doesn't bode well, as you were saying. But I also think that at the end of the day, these things have something of a snapback effect that we can be hopeful for, right? In other words, first of all, I should say that if we parse out if we went deeper into the numbers of the 40%, I think we would probably find some interesting things, including that a lot of people, because of the ecological crisis and because of COVID and other things that have happened, that caused them to rise in their sense that oh my gosh, it looks like the end of the world is about to come. I think as some of these things pass again, just they were I think the numbers were at a high point around 88 reasons in 88, and then it didn't happen, right? And so then that can cause people to go, huh, right? But I think one other thing that I would add that relates to what you were saying and then also to what Megan was asking earlier, I think this is where, one can hope that the situation stabilizes to the point, but I happen to know, and you may have experienced this too, but a lot of evangelicals, say from Biola University, where this is the norm, they went on things like study abroads to Israel. And after actually going to, because Bethlehem and many of these areas are within the West Bank, and going and seeing the actual situation, a lot of them came back going, I don't care what I've been taught, this just can't be right, And I think that's an area where study abroad education can be really important in that regard.
Thanks for some really interesting presentations tonight, and I've learned a lot. I'm somebody who's been working on this issue as a political scientist for decades, and for all the terrible things that have happened in the last 2 months, one can say at least that now people are talking about these issues, and this teach-in is an example of an effort by many people to learn more about the situation. I'm specifically interested in knowing what kinds of discussions are going on inside the Jewish community in the United States and also in Israel in terms of what are the spaces now? Have they opened up or have they contracted for real examination of the history of Zionism, Zionistic thought, and the role of Zionism in contemporary politics?
Good. I'll start with that. So in the United States, right? So I've been involved both as political science studying it, but also as a Jewish peace activist since the time of the first Intifada in the late 1980s. That it's actually gotten a lot better in the American Jewish community, at least the broader rank and file. There's a lot more receptivity to thinking about the Nakba, questioning how Zionism played out, being willing to think about the contradiction between a Jewish state and a democratic state. So the mainstream American Jewish organizations, including Hillel, the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, they're all very worried because they know they're losing the long-term battle, even though they still got the donors. Right now, they got the big thing still on their side. They got the elite politicians. But at the grassroots level, and particularly those under 40, the American Jewish community is really becoming very open. So there's lots of these discussions. If not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, or say the more moderate like J Street. But there's all sorts of groups now within the United States that are very open to asking these fundamental questions. That was far less true than when I was in my 20s. So that I take hope in. Unfortunately, in Israel, for now, it's moved in the reverse direction. Young Israeli Jews, I think in part because of how the educational system has played out there, they're actually less open. So you got this contradiction. I would say like the vanguard of any kind of Jewish reformation is probably going to have to come within the United States and not within Israel. And within Israel, it's actually narrowing. Within the United States, it's growing considerably.
Yeah, speaking as someone who came from the Oslo generation, growing up with the two-state solution on the horizon, I've watched many of my peers. I think the under 40 American Jewish community has long been living this double life, this connection to Israel via relatives or religion, but also despising Netanyahu. And so those things and wanting the occupation to end. And so I think those things have really coexisted for the last 20 years, wanting a two-state solution, hating Netanyahu, seeing the ultra-nationalism be inconsistent with Jewish values. And so, I agree with Jonathan that there is some sort of reckoning about, what are American Jewish values and are those distinct from Jewish values in Israel?
If I may ask a question, actually it's more of a comment too. I've done a lot of interviews in Palestine and Israel with Palestinian elders, and they spoke of a long history of coexistence between Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims. And that history far outdates the 75-year history of the Jewish state. So that's one thing that gives me actually quite a lot of hope. And there is a small Palestinian Jewish community that still lives near Nablus that refused to join the state of Israel. They have special privileges. But I'm wondering if you guys can reflect a little bit on the examples of pre-48 coexistence and that very small group of Palestinian Jews that still lives in Nablus with Palestinians, speaks Arabic, and is still consider themselves non-Israelis.
I teach a lot of Ottoman history, and somehow there were 400 years before nationalism where Baghdad was a pretty good place to be born a Jew, definitely a lot better than most places in Eastern Europe. I think the challenge is their devolved system called the millet system delegated so much to the religious community. It delegated education, charity, it delegated the court system to the religious community. So there were communal rights rather than individual rights. And I think that is the challenge when we're thinking about a communalism or a federal communal coexistence, is what rights will people have to give up to their elders in order to achieve a coexistence like that?
I guess I'd say two things. One is, of course, one to be careful not to romanticize it. That there were long tensions also. I mean, so these things came up. But nevertheless, I think your broader point is an important one, is that there were long periods of decent, not ideal, but decent coexistence. Ella Shochat, who I write about in my book, so she's from Iraqi Jewish background, and so her parents are in that generation where, with both Zionism taking off and this narrow Arab nationalism taking off, suddenly these, what we now call the Arab Jews, they're between a rock and a hard place. Within Israel, they're seen as still, there's an Arabness that's making them inferior. But now within the Arab world, they're Jewish, so they can't be Arab. So you get this unfortunate confluence by the 20th century where it hardens, both for Zionism, but also for Arab nationalism. And so that, I think, was a tragic direction where this is, I think all three of us are in agreement of being very against this ethno-nationalism. But that is something crucial to overcome without writing off any kind of self-determination. I'm someone who still takes self-determination seriously, but this idea that you can't allow for fluidity and interaction between them, but that is one of the great tragedies, really, sort of in that world in the 20th century.
Yeah, I fully agree with what was just said by both of my colleagues here, but as someone who literally wears, as part of my Orthodox clerical dress, the robe that Ted was referring to, meaning like we still have the Turkish Ottoman judge's robe, like all of the clergy wear this because the clergy became the rulers of the various groups. Well, when my late Archbishop came to America, he reportedly threw his robe over the side of the boat, going, like, I don't need this imposed thing on me anymore. And so, like, similar to what Jonathan was saying, on some level, and also Ted, we can, on the one hand, we can look back to the Ottoman period as definitely better coexistence than is going on right now, but kind of just tying into this, some of the things I've said before, like we've got to evolve as a species. We've got to move beyond this kind of notion of separatism. We need to be able to find ways, like Jonathan was talking about, of having our identities, but also being able to share and adapt and interact with each other in ways that cross-pollinate, as it were. And that, again, is why, in my own case, why I was so attracted to comparative religions and especially comparative theology, because the idea behind that is that you don't lose your identity. You don't necessarily just turn into, I'm not, throw off my religious idea, but you cultivate an actual openness to the other, and the idea that you can learn from their culture and from their religion and from their spirituality. And I really think this is like the you know, as much as we can look at I think the Ottoman period shows us, you know, being better, shows us the problem of like nation state colonial imposition upon the world. But we need to also evolve beyond that kind of separatism that was imposed by the millet system of the Ottoman Empire.
Sure. We have time for one more.
It's just kind of a follow-up on what you just said. I think on an individual level, it's very easy to break those barriers of being ethnocentric, and but then things like this happen, and the systemic, you know, ways really quickly break that for individuals as well. I mean, I talk about this at a personal level right now. It's like, as an immigrant here, Palestinian, Lebanese, also Colombian, right? And then I have all these friends and all these things, and it feels super easy when things are going great to be a part of a whole, and then things like this happen, and the system quickly reminds you that we are not one, and our privileges are not the same, and the way the world perceives us are not the same. So maybe if you can go deeper into a solution, or maybe just some ways in which us as individuals can help further break that system, right? Because I think as humans, like, it's very easy, and like it really is super easy to love others and like of other cultures and feel love from them, and it's very easy then to break the patterns of the systems that are fundamentalist that we grew up in. But yeah, just if you could go further on that, that'd be great.
So I think, you know, this is where I joked. Maybe some people that were there here on Friday thought I was just joking, but like this is actually just how I dress. No, I don't wear my anarcho-commie hat just to panels or things like that. But it undergirds, you know, for me, my spirituality, right? Like, I think hopefully people understood, like, when I used the phrase demonic, for example, earlier, that I wasn't speaking in some fundamentalist way, right? Like one of my jokes is that, you know, evangelicals always looking for where the devil's hiding, except right where he actually is. To think dialectically with people like Marx and Hegel, I think is actually, and to kind of have both, I guess what I would say is the realistic hopes of people like Martin Luther King is essential in this situation. I think as Americans, we have been conditioned to instant gratification, that our microwave burrito is, you know, a problem, that it's 90 seconds instead of 60. And that we transfer this without even realizing it onto social problems. We think about social problems in terms of like, well, what can I do to fix it now? And then when we don't have anything, then we fall into despair. And then the answer is to do nothing for so many of us. That was not MLK's way of understanding things, right? MLK, in his last public words, right, were to recognize, like, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight we will reach the promised land. Right? And in the rest of that speech, the mountaintop speech, he literally goes through and talks about how imagining God showing him different time periods that he could have lived in, you know, including the future, and what King affirms is the life that he was given and the role that he had to play in the here and now. And I think that's what we all need to really, you know, that's the best I can say, is to focus on the roles that we can play in building human relationships, educating people, showing solidarity where we can, having a true loyalty to humanity where we can, but also taking the long view of history and saying, well, there's a heck of a lot things better now, like than there used to be. And that in this world that, you know, just like that separatism that we were talking about before, globalization like forces us not to see that thing, you see things as separate anymore. And so right now, even just the technology that has moved, right, the whole world is watching. It's a catastrophe. It's horrific. But I genuinely have hope that this is part of the sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back dialectic of history, in which at the end of this, there will become greater realization of our common humanity, as long as we are all willing to individually do our part in working for it. I don't know if that...
All right, I'll just relate it to at the university level is that I'm on this presidential task force on addressing anti-Semitism at San Diego State, and we're all identify ourselves as Jewish. I was long more kind of that relatively dissenting voice in terms of, you know, not wanting a definition of anti-Semitism that included anti-Zionism. But we were more or less getting along for a while. But then after October 7th, when I dissented from just demanding just an outright condemnation of Hamas and nothing else, I was accused of just being an apologist for Hamas and just a self-hater and all that stuff. So part of me is thought, wow, at the universities it's become, including San Diego State, it's become pretty intolerant. And there's a lot of crackdowns. But then I kind of stepped back. Ted and I were part of Teach-In at San Diego State, and you're having them here too, is that the university actually still remains this forum for kind of open-ended reflection, and particularly pushing along the theme that Oscar's talking about. Rico, sorry, been a long night. That remains, I think a lot of universities still remain kind of this healthy forum. It may be what really worries kind of those who are so dead set on like defending Israel at all costs, is they're slowly losing the universities, but before they lose them, they're going to struggle mightily to try to shut down these voices. But ultimately, I don't think they're succeeding. It's true they're scaring away some, but the universities, including in San Diego, are remaining a forum for these more open-ended conversations.
Don't really have anything to add to that.